A very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Newsline Live. Now then, ahead of what may or may not happen in terms of the 13th Amendment and the political expenditure laws, we thought we'd ask someone who knows a thing or two about these matters, and that is, of course, the Executive Director of the Centre for Policy Alternatives, Dr. Pakisoti Saravanamuthu. Very good evening, Dr. Sara.
Very good evening to you too.
And Dr. Saravanamuthu, can we just touch on this elections expenditure laws or act? How necessary is it?
Well, I think election expenditure campaign finance is necessary because there are huge sums of money that are spent. But there's one school of thought that says that instead of putting caps on how much candidates or indeed political parties can spend in an election, what is important is the transparency, that the public knows from where they're getting their funds, and then the public can decide. Because it isn't always the case that the party with the most amount of resources actually wins the election. You know, but I think we do need this because the figures that you're given with regard to any election are quite stupendous.
But you know, I hear what you say, and we too, we've kept asking about a sort of political donations act, something on the lines of perhaps Singapore, perhaps. But whilst we say that, the asset declarations of members of parliament routinely kept with the speaker. I can buy it, but I can't discuss it with you.
No, I think all of those laws need to be changed.
Yeah.
The public should have access to the assets and declaration laws. Indeed, the assets and declaration laws should be made public. Because if anyone wants to stand to be a representative of the public, we should know.
But do you detect a commitment from any political party that would give you some satisfaction that at some point this will happen?
I don't detect any commitment from any political party. The political parties can turn around and tell their candidates, look, it is mandatory that you provide your assets and declarations or else you don't get candidacy. You know, and likewise the Election Commission should turn around and say to them, look, if you don't provide this, then you can't really take your seat in Parliament because we won't certify that you've been elected.
And your organisation, have you all been...
We have been going on about campaign finance for the last 10 to 15 years. Now we've got close to it, but the law at the present moment, I mean, in terms of the focus of it is on the individuals rather than on the parties. And the punishments or the deterrents or whatever it is are not very great. You know, you're talking about fines of 100 rupees and 300 rupees and all of that, which is just not going to make any difference.
And what's the point of having these asset declarations locked up in some safe place in the Speaker's office?
No, precisely. They must be made public.
And is this election, you know, the expenditure law, is that all part of the same sort of thing?
What do you mean?
Political Donations Act.
Well, I mean, no, there isn't a Political Donations Act as yet. Not yet. Yeah. So the law that has been brought is only half the cake, as it were, if at all. Yeah.
And it only deals with...
Well, it's focusing on the candidates.
Right, okay.
And their expenditure.
What about parties, political parties?
No, exactly. Political parties too. I mean, you know, political parties, have you ever seen the accounts of a political party?
I've seen one a very long time ago for the United National Party.
A very long time ago, and you probably saw it privately.
Yes, of course.
No, so this is what I'm saying is that should they be made public?
That seems to be part of the problem, though. But nowadays, in this whole so-called quest to get IMF funding for Sri Lanka and support, the Indians made some form of an announcement, and then lo and behold, all of a sudden, the press, the media, everybody else, all talking about the 13th Amendment, apparently the full implementation of the 13th Amendment. Do you think, Dr. Saravanamuthu, that this will actually happen, that it will be implemented, or is this some kind of optical game?
Well, as you know, the 13th Amendment is part of the Constitution.
Yes.
But that part of the Constitution hasn't been fully implemented. So as the President said, look, this is part of the Constitution, I'm not doing anything new, if Parliament disagrees with me, Parliament then should then bring a bill to repeal the 13th Amendment. So the question of as to whether, it could happen or not is really a bit moot insofar as the President is saying, I'm going to implement the Constitution. Now, the irony of the matter, of course, is this, is that whilst he's talking about implementing in full the 13th Amendment, we don't have provincial councils. And we haven't had them for 4 to 5 years. So there is then going to be the question of when are we going to have provincial council elections? When are we going to establish a police commission, a provincial police commission, the necessary modalities of the land, and all of that kind of thing, which is going to require an actual provincial council in place in the 9 provinces in this country. So at one level it is good that at least we are getting over that. That is a basic sort of starting point with regard to a resolution of the national question, that this be implemented in full. And I think there is more or less an overall consensus on the part of the Tamil parties that yes, this should be implemented if it is going to be there. However, there is a lot more that has to be done. And there is a lot more that has to be done in terms of actual implementation on the ground. To make sure that it's not just a gesture.
Thank you very much for your questions. 0772 300 305. I'll just take one of these here. What about keeping the campaign finance records? How long do you think they'll be held, or should they be held?
Well, I think, you can digitize them, and then you can hold them for however long you need to. Yeah, so those records should be digitized. And indeed, this is one of the things that we should avail ourselves of the available technology to make government more efficient and government more, equal.
And another person is asking, please ask Dr. Saravanamuthu how we can check if members of Parliament have been paying this new tax.
No, so that, of course, is a question of, well, we should be allowed to file RTI petitions to find that out. Otherwise there's no other way, because they might turn around and say, look, this is entirely our private affair, and it's nobody else's business. But this is the question, is that, look, if you're going to have people come forward wanting to represent their citizens, there must be a sense of a public affairs culture which allows for transparency and accountability. We need to be able to have, or try to aspire as much as possible, to the notion that our representatives are like Caesar's wife, above suspicion.
In Britain we had Nadim Zahawi, who was sort of sacked from the chairmanship of the party because, and of course he's minister without portfolio. But he was removed because he failed to tell them that there was an investigation going on. Not that he did something wrong and all that business, but because he failed to tell them about an investigation. And then he had to pay all this thing, and it didn't matter that he was the chairman of the party. I would find it extremely difficult to believe that any of our political parties would get rid of their chairman for not declaring an investigation.
Well, this is the point. This is why we need a proper public culture, a public affairs culture where there is an emphasis on transparency, on accountability, on all of that. Otherwise, we are going to get into situations like we've got ourselves in today. A crisis of governance, essentially.
And somebody else is asking what I'm going to ask you. The implementation of the 13th Amendment, do you think, even if it is fully implemented, will it sort of achieve the aspirations of the Tamil community?
No, it won't, I don't think. There will be some who will be satisfied with the full implementation. But if you look at the 13th Amendment, and if you look at the Supreme Court judgment with regard to it, the balance of powers in the 13th Amendment are heavily weighted in favor of the centre. The role of the governor as the representative of the president is also crucial there. All of those things have to be changed if we are really talking about proper, meaningful devolution. And when Mahinda Rajapaksa in 2009 started talking about 13th Amendment plus, we need to find out what exactly that meant. Was it just a question of saying that, look, there will be a second chamber made up of provincial representatives, and what were their powers going to be? We need to find all of that out.
And but take us back into history, Dr. Sarah. Why was there a call? What was the catalyst for this call to have the 13th Amendment?
Well, the catalyst for the call was that the Tamil people in particular felt that if they had to rely on the centre for everything, that they were going to be discriminated and were being discriminated against. So what was the argument with regard to federalism? What is the argument with regard to the concept of subsidiarity? Let the people in the provinces take care of their own affairs to the extent that they can. Those affairs that they cannot take care of should go to the central government. And so what we are talking about is a system where, you know, you want to be apart from, but yet you are a part of. You reconcile the demands for autonomy with the obvious realities of interdependence. You know, in a sense, that's what a federal system is. You know, and
in this, typically, let's say, if we all accepted that, what would central government be reduced to do?
Well, the central government, for example, if you have a crime committed in a particular province, and if the criminal is supposed to escape into another province, I mean, like you have in the United States, you have an FBI.
Right.
Yeah. You have common defense, common human rights, common currency.
Common taxes?
Yes.
That's a big
oh yes, you will
subject.
pay provincial taxes as well as federal taxes. You know.
And why do you think that's this whole idea of implementing the 13th Amendment seems to be so contentious with some of the majority parties in this country?
Well, the parties that are largely representing the majority community in this country have a problem in particular about police powers, because they feel that that could form the nucleus again of an armed group that might fight for secession and whatever. You know, so I think that is the principal concern, that through the implementation, by giving police powers to the provinces, that you might actually be stoking the fires of secession once more.
But, you know, for all the talk about, you know, we know how to handle the security situation and this, that, and the other, we had the Easter bombings. We then had wide-scale protests. We then saw the almost sort of loose application of the Prevention of Terrorism Act to arrest various people who were exercising their constitutional right to protest. And so security seems to be this sort of big mainstay, the main anchor of all these parties.
No, and it is a nonsense. I mean, let's take security. We have a defense budget which eclipses the combined total for health and education. We're supposed to have the 7th or something like that largest standing army in the world. Now, if you look at that standing army, where is it mostly deployed? It is mostly deployed in the north. Right. You go to Jaffna and you talk to anyone and you will find out, you ask them, what is the biggest problem here? They will tell you drugs. Where are the drugs coming from? South India. So you have the largest concentration of the army there, and yet you have a tremendous drugs problem. 2 and 2 makes 4. You know, there has to be a realistic look at what our security requirements for. And I mean, again, the point is this: out of the forces that we have, the largest force is the army. We are an island. One would argue that perhaps it should be the Navy.
Indeed. Let's discuss that after the break. And it's now time to have a peek at this evening's headlines from the wonderful primetime news team up here on the 3rd floor. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
News First headlines. Main sponsor.
Durden's Hospital, dedicated to you.
Port workers take to the streets and threaten severe action if unjust taxes are not lifted. Professionals give the government one more week to withdraw unjust tax. CEB takes a step back. No power cuts today and tomorrow. Constitutional Council calls for applications for independent commissions. Leader of the opposition questions renewed attempt to delay elections. Appointments to commissions not a reason to delay elections, says the Election Commissioner General. Over 12,000 affidavits. The release of Vasa Budalige.
News First headline sponsor.
Durden's Hospital, dedicated to you. Experience the best healthcare. Durden Hospital's new Alfred Place Wing.
News First.
An ambulance to deliver world-class care. Durden's Hospital, dedicated to you.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And welcome back to New Live. I'm in conversation with Dr. Pakisoti Saranmuthu, the Executive Director of the CPA, the Centre for Policy Alternatives. Dr. Sara, do you think that the President is fully committed to the implementation? Variants are not with him. As the Executive President, can he go ahead anyway?
Well, I think the President is committed to the implementation of the 13th Amendment in full. The point is very simply, it's part of the Constitution. He's not going beyond that. He's not bringing a new law. The questions about the legitimacy of his government and all of that, I don't think arise. He is the President. He is implementing the Constitution of the land. Now, with regard to, people will say that he is trying to pander to ethnic sentiments in the north and east because he wants to get their votes for a future presidential election, and that since the government is not supposed to be doing anything, they want to show that they're dealing with the national question. He is the President, and he says he's going to implement the Constitution. And he has said, look, if you don't agree with me, bring a bill to Parliament to repeal the 13th Amendment. So those who are opposed to it, particularly those in Parliament, have the challenge of bringing a bill and getting rid of it, getting rid of the 13th Amendment, and they need a two-thirds majority.
And somebody is saying, well, there are different people. Some are saying great program. Others are saying, for example, one of them is saying, isn't all this business about the 13th Amendment, isn't it just to satisfy IMF and more particularly India?
Well, as far as I know, the IMF has not said anything about the 13th Amendment. Giving police powers and land powers to the provinces is not part, I don't think, of the conditionalities of the IMF. Yes, India, after all, was the godfather, if you like, of the 13th Amendment, and would like to see it implemented in full. We have failed to implement this for how many years now? 1988, I think it was. Yeah. So for 35 odd years, we have not implemented it. It's the Constitution of our country. It's the Constitution of our country. Successive presidents.
What can bearing in mind that the Supreme Court recently went into sort of uncharted territory and took a firm stance unanimously about those orders of compensation. What of the 13th Amendment? Has anyone been to the Supreme Court to say, look, this is there, but the politicians are not implementing it?
No one has gone to the Supreme Court, as far as I know, calling for the implementation of it. And I suppose perhaps the attitude of the court would be, we do not want to get involved in political affairs. Because, very simply, the answer is, look, if you are not going to implement this amendment to the Constitution, which therefore is a part of the Constitution, repeal it.
And Dr. Saramuthu, do we really need elections when there is no money for medicines? And
well, my understanding is that there is a budget allocation to hold these elections, and we have to balance, of course, yes, the daily livelihood needs of food and medicine and all of that against preserving our democracy. And I think elections are tremendously important for the democracy because it will give people a chance to vent their frustrations.
But we have a national problem right now.
Yes, but local government elections are across the country. Furthermore, there are political parties that have to clarify their positions with regard to the IMF, with regard to the 13th Amendment. All of that will have to be done in the context of a general election. It's very important that that happens. The JVP, the Peratugami, the SJB with regard to 13th Amendment, all of these things need to be clarified and communicated. And, you know, you sort of let out steam from the system, or else it's going to all build up and implode.
And we have several questions. My goodness. The worry for the Muslims of the East is the clause in the 13th Amendment which says on a simple majority in Parliament can merge the North and East.
Well, they went to court and got the merger, got rid of the merger of the two provinces, so that issue should not arise again.
Right.
Yeah. So now we have a separate eastern province and we have a northern province.
Several questions asking, really, is this the turning point? Is this the president who's going to actually implement the 13th Amendment?
Well, he says he is going to implement the 13th Amendment. There is some legislation that will have to follow, I think, with regard to land. There's going to be a Land Commission Act and all of that. So I think he will do that. And the thing is this, is that the argument against Ranil Wickremesinghe presidency is the argument not of legality, it's the argument of legitimacy. But here he is saying, look, I am the president of this country, there is the constitution of this country, and all I'm doing is implementing the constitution.
Yeah. And because I'm legitimately here.
Yeah.
And
or legally here or whatever, yeah.
Indeed. But what do you see are the pitfalls that, what are the difficulties for the president to implement this?
I think the pitfalls, the impediments, the obstacles are always going to be with the bureaucracy. You know, it's always going to be with the bureaucracy that does not necessarily buy in to the reform agenda. You know, I think in 2005 we had something like 350,000 members on the public service payroll. Now we have almost 1.5 million. You know, so these are people who, do they have a commitment, a real commitment to public service and public affairs? Do they really have the expertise to do whatever is necessary? I'm sure there are some who do, but then what about the others? You know, invariably every single person that you talk to who has tried to work with government will tell you of the endless frustration of working with the bureaucracy. So something has to be done with regard to that.
Do you detect a unity amongst all the minority sort of parties representing the minority interests, you know, like this LMC, for example, and Mr. Sumandran and Mr. Nesran? Is there a need for all of them to get on the same page?
Well, I mean, if we are talking about a serious solution to the national question, there has to be a consensus amongst them. You know, and it can't just be the minimum consensus of, look, okay, we implement the 13th Amendment, yes. That is the starting point at the present moment because it has been around and it's part of the Constitution. But to go beyond that, there needs to be a consensus amongst them.
But what about the 225 in Parliament, the majority? Don't you think that they'll be thinking of their vote base and those people who will shout and say Rata Bedano?
No, so that is why I've always said that, you know, particularly after the Aragala, we hope that it has facilitated this. You need to have a vision of the country that takes all of this into account. It's a vision of Sri Lanka, and that requires resolving the questions of corruption, bringing in accountability, transparency, but also bringing into that the resolution of this national question. And you need to have parties that fall in line behind that and campaign all over the country. You know, if you remember the time when President Kumaratunga was bringing in that August 94, whatever it is, the new constitution, August 2000 constitution, she decided to have the Sudu Nelum to go around the country talking about devolution and all of that. You need a public campaign of that kind. Because, you know, you go and talk to people, you say you talk about devolution, you talk about the 13th Amendment, you talk even about federalism. Once they recognize that this is a system of governance which empowers them, they will come on board.
Several questions. People are, from what I can gather, sort of skeptical of the president's intention, saying that he's obviously trying to garner the votes in the north.
What politician does anything without a consideration of the electoral consequences? You know, this is absurd. No, what do we expect of our politicians? They don't fall from the sky. They can't come up from under a stone. They are us. And they have their interests and the interests of their party as well. If you don't find a politician who is ambitious and who is not interested in power, then I don't think that person is going to succeed or is worthy of the name of politicians, but they must have a moral compass.
Dr. Saravanamuthu, what is the international community that you are in line with, or who you interact with? What are they saying to you, you know, about the unity and equity in Sri Lanka?
Well, I mean, I think the general position of the international community, as in those people, for example, who voted for the resolution on Sri Lanka in the Human Rights Council, and they are largely the sort of Western-dominated international community, I think they hold their noses with regard to the human rights dimension, but they support the government with regard to the conditionalities of the IMF and all of that. So they're generally supportive, but they would like to see the human rights situation improve, and yes, I think they would like to see elections as well. You know, so what they would like to see, therefore, is a government that is legal, legitimate, and can get on with the job, persuade the people to make the sacrifices that we have to make. You know, there are going to be winners and losers, and perhaps there are going to be more losers. And the future, in terms of the short and mid-term future, is going to be determined by how the losers react to their new circumstances, and how the government reacts to how they react to their new circumstances.
And I think this might be the last question. The president is apparently struggling to implement measures to counter corruption successfully. So do you believe, Dr. Sara, that the president can succeed in implementing the 13th Amendment successfully? He can't fight corruption.
Well, I mean, I think implementing the 13th Amendment and fighting corruption are two different things, because
I think the viewer is asking about the difficulties.
Fighting corruption also requires going outside, following the money, finding out who is involved in all of that, and it will take time. And let's face it, I mean, I don't know of a single case where a deposed president or a deposed regime that was accused of financial corruption, where the successor regime has been able to get a majority of that money back. I mean, if you look at the Philippines, Bongbong Marcos is now the president of the Philippines. I don't think they got 10% of the money that the Marcoses allegedly stole.
Right.
Yeah, so it is a question of demonstrating sincerity by pursuing it properly. And I think in 2015, 2019, that Yahapalina government didn't quite do that.
And that's the problem?
Yes, that is a major problem.
Dr. Saravanamuthu, thank you very much. The Executive Director of the CPA, the Centre for Policy Alternatives, our guest this evening. Thank you very much for being on Newsline Live. And that's the way it was. And it's now time to actually listen to the primetime news from that wonderful team out there. Take care, have a great evening as much as you can, and God bless you all.